and it's my very great honor to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm going to be as quick as possible, but there are a number of people I need to thank, and something I want to say in introducing Professor Holt this evening. I want to thank, first of all, this institution, the Linden Hall Library, for having supported this project from the very beginning. I sat down with John Gray, the past head librarian, some months back to discuss the possibility of pulling together the work that we were doing with the Wiles Colloquium and the Hidden Connections project that the Linden Hall has hosted over the past year. And John was very generous, as has been John Killen, the present librarian of the Linden Hall Library, and I'm grateful to both of them. Also to Melvin Lyons, who worked very hard over a 2-week period to try to put together the panels that you'll see outside the room tonight. So, deep thanks from all of us to the Linden Hall Library for hosting this event. As most of you know, tonight's lecture is the keynote for a 2-day conference on slave emancipation in the United States that is being hosted by the Wiles Colloquium at Queen's University. 2 days of discussion around one of the most vibrant topics in the field of American history. And thanks especially to the generous support of the Wiles Trust, and I'd like to acknowledge the Trevor and Heather Boyd here tonight as representatives of the Trust. Thanks to their generous support, we've been able to bring over a group of scholars from really all over the world, but many of them from the United States, from the UK and Ireland, and for what will be a unique and exceptional 2 days of discussion. So we're grateful to the Wiles Trust in the first place, also to the School of History and Anthropology at Queen's. Those of you who have come to see us for these 2 days will know that Professor David Hayden, who's the head of school, has worked very hard at supporting this project, and also our school secretary, Catherine Boone, has worked very hard at making all the arrangements to make sure that people arrive, and you all did, so it's worked out well. I also want to thank my colleagues teaching American history at Queen's, Professor Catherine Clinton and Anthony Stanonis, and finally my partners in the After Slavery Project, Susan O'Donovan, Bruce Baker, and Daniel Brown, who've also worked hard, and the postgraduates who've made it possible to pull this off at Queen's over the last couple of days. Okay, the thanks, I've probably missed somebody, but most of the thanks, the preliminaries, are out of the way. And I want to introduce Professor Holt. When Susan and Bruce and myself began to think a year or more ago about what sort of a colloquium we wanted to pull together, we thought that we wanted to bring somebody who knew the contours and the substance of U.S. slave emancipation, but who could make us think in expansive terms and global terms about what slave emancipation meant in the United States and how it was related to a process of emancipation that affected a large chunk of the globe at the time. And there's a very short list of people, as you might imagine, who are in a position to pull that off. We've got more than one of them in the room tonight, we're fortunate to say. But Professor Holt's name really sort of stood out as somebody who could provide us with that sort of a talk. And I won't go into great detail about his work, but I'll just say a couple things. Professor Holt's first book, Black Over White, Negro Leadership in South Carolina During Reconstruction, which was published in 1977, is still a pioneering work that made it possible to no longer to speak in monolithic terms about the Black South after emancipation, raising important questions that really still present important fundamental problems in the Reconstruction historiography. The Southern Historical Association had the great foresight to award Professor Holt the Charles Sindner Prize for the best book in Southern history for Black Over White. His research since that time has moved south to the West Indies, and especially to slave emancipation in Britain's sugar colony in Jamaica. In 1992, Professor Holt published The Problem of Freedom, Race, Labor, and Politics in Jamaica and Britain, 1832 to 1938. A study which, among its many accomplishments, demonstrated the link between prospects for substantive freedom for the former slaves and struggles against inequality in Britain itself, and even with elite responses to the famine in Ireland. In 1995, the Association of Caribbean Historians awarded Professor Holt the El Segovia Prize for the problem of freedom. Professor Holt is co-author with Rebecca Scott and Frederick Cooper of Beyond Slavery, Explorations of Race, Labor, and Citizenship in Post-Emancipation Societies, published in 2000, of a major textbook on African American history, and in 2000 also published an extremely relevant reflection on his work and on the world that we live in, the world we've inherited, entitled The Problem of Race in the 21st Century, published by Harvard. Professor Holt is James, John Killen's already attempted this, but I'll try again, James Westfall Thompson Distinguished Professor of American and African American History at the University of Chicago, and is currently a fellow at the University...
At the American Academy.
American Academy in Berlin, sorry. It's my great pleasure indeed to welcome Professor Holt now to our audience.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. Reminds me that I need to get rid of that title. Even I can't say it. Thanks also for to Brian and to Queen's University and to the Boyds for the opportunity to be here tonight. And I also appreciate your coming out to hear me. On a Saturday evening in April 1793, some 2 centuries and 12 years ago, I think, several hundred black slaves near a village in the French West Indian colony of Guadeloupe. The village was called Trois-Rivières, rose in revolt against their enslavers, killing 22 of them. After laying waste to several properties, they organized themselves into quasi-military units, posted sentries to secure the estate, and sent a detachment marching toward Basse-Terre, the island capital. As they approached the town, they encountered French soldiers who, having been alerted to the revolt, had set out to put it down. When the two groups came within firing range of each other, a soldier called out, "Who goes there?" To which one of the blacks responded, "Citizens and friends." A squad of French soldiers approached the slave rebels and began questioning them. "Are you citizens? Are you patriots?" they asked. "We are friends," a rebel replied. "We have come to save you and hate only those aristocrats who want to kill you. We want to fight for the republic, the law, the nation, and order." Then followed an extraordinary scene in which black slave rebels and French soldiers marched to the provincial capital as comrades in arms, shouting "Vive la République." Although it would take another half century before slavery was finally abolished in France's American empire, events that evening played a small role in setting the course for that emancipation. France abolished slavery for good in 1848, in the midst of yet another revolutionary upheaval at home. Now, if we fast forward 2 centuries later, we find ourselves at the celebration of the 150th anniversary of that latter event. It was a celebration made even more notable because the French press subjected it to a rather bold scrutiny, pointing out, for example, that this was the first time that the anniversary of emancipation had been acknowledged in quite a while, possibly because it raised such embarrassing questions about the nation's founding traditions. But while citizens of France could be proud that their national revolution had lent decisive support to the slaves' resistance and the overthrow of colonial slavery, they must hang their heads in shame that with the revolution's unraveling, slavery had been reinstated just 8 years later in 1802, and allowed to endure for another generation, 1848. The French Revolution initiated liberty and citizenship for all, and yet in the end, it left millions in bondage. Correcting this neglect at long last, Jacques Chirac, the conservative president of the Republic in 1998, marked the anniversary of emancipation by intoning a tribute whose themes many of us will recognize as echoes of Latin American historian Frank Tannenbaum's seminal work, Slaves and Citizen, or Slave and Citizen. In his 1947 book, Tannenbaum had argued that the true measure of the severity of a slave system was the degree to which it recognized what he called the moral personality of the slave, and thus moved the path of the ex-slave's eventual acceptance as a citizen. President Chirac invoked a similar gauge to assess French emancipation. In 1848, he declared the emancipated slave passed rapidly to assume his role and identity as a citizen of France, a fluid transition for which the nation should feel proud. Here was a fitting emblem for their nation's special capacity to integrate foreigners into Frenchness. But when Chirac's bold words appeared in Le Monde the next day, they were juxtaposed with a cartoon of a black figure with each hand manacled. On one side, a chain that had bound him to a white slave master labeled 1848 was broken. On the other side, however, he was fastened to a departing airplane by an unbroken chain labeled 1998. With this cartoon, or what this cartoon signified, was the fact that at the very moment that Chirac spoke, his administration was embroiled in a heated controversy over the nation's policy of deporting refugees from France's former African colonies. Even then, a small group of these sans-papiers, as they were called, meaning those without legal entry documents, had barricaded themselves in a Catholic church seeking asylum. Many others, however, were being rounded up daily and sent home. Thousands of French people, along with a sprinkling of other nationals, including myself, took to the streets to protest this blatantly two-faced policy of Chirac's government. But in fact, Asylum and Manifestation were just the latest of many acts of solidarity with the beleaguered Africans. In his magnificent book, A Colony of Citizens, historian Laurent Dubois described a poignant ritual, public ritual, in the low town hall of Pétain, a village just outside Paris, on June 30th, 1997. The assistant mayor there, a socialist and thus opposed to Chirac's government, donning the tricolor slash that is the emblem of the Republic and of his official authority, received 10 sans-papiers, one by one, into the Hall of Justice. There, each of them was accompanied by 2 French citizens who declared their wish to become godparents of these undocumented aliens. Though undertaken as a practical act aimed at facilitating resistance to deportation, the assumption of godparentage was also an act heavily freighted with symbolism. The alien was being taken into the family, both the personal family of his or her sponsor and the larger national family. In many ways, then, this act of adoption echoed the bold greeting and hopes of the rebels at Trois-Rivières 2 centuries earlier, to be citizens and friends. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, and almost exactly 2 years before, the sans-papiers controversy brought Jacques Chirac's government, conservative government, to the brink of crisis. The New York Times broke a story about a sweatshop uncovered in Los Angeles, California. A group of more than 70 Mexican and Thai women were found working under conditions that the reporter could only describe as slave-like. Deprived of physical mobility and effectively of actual wages, they labored to manufacture luxury goods for the shelves of some of America's most famous fashion emporiums, Macy's, Lord & Taylor's, and so on. What was especially striking about this incident, however, was that some weeks later, a suit was brought on behalf of these workers based on the constitutional prohibition against involuntary labor. That's in the 13th Amendment. Less than half a decade before America celebrated the dawn of the 21st century, therefore, a charge of slavery was being adjudicated in a federal court. What next? Was it possible that a 20th century Dred Scott decision was in the making? Were these undocumented American sans-papiers be declared to have no rights that the natives were bound to respect. Fortunately, matters did not take that bizarre turn. But it has turned out that the 1995 Los Angeles case was simply the first of many such cases exposed over the waning years of the last century. Almost every major American vendor of clothing was implicated at one time or another: Nike's, Gap, Sears, and of course Walmart, in one of these cases. The factories were found in hovels and forbidden corners of our major cities and in elaborate offshore installations, like the one uncovered in the American-controlled Marianas. In the latter location, there was a further twist, suggesting a global, multinational character to the enterprise reminiscent of the days of the transatlantic slave trade. For in the Marianas case, the factory on American soil was being run by Chinese entrepreneurs who brought in Asian labor from impoverished countries around the Pacific Rim. Meanwhile, much closer to home, other Chinese entrepreneurs, some U.S. citizens, some not, operated similar factories in places like Sunset Park in Brooklyn, New York. Now, invoking the emotionally charged words slave trade is not hyperbole, nor is the comparison intended as some kind of shock tactic. Often when we tender comparisons like this of something contemporary, of something as being contemporary with slavery, it is merely a rhetorical flourish intended to render something beyond the pale by association with something immediately recognized as archaic. In such cases, the device relies on the assumption that our temporal distance from slavery will shock us into action. But of course, it also assumes that we are no longer within the same historical field of reference as slavery. That is, that bygone era shares nothing in common with the reality of our present. By contrast, in these cases, as the legal suits involving the 13th Amendment attest, the association is quite literal. Workers toil behind locked doors of hovels with unbelievable sanitary facilities. They had to get permission to go to the toilet and did so under utterly humiliating surveillance. Although ostensibly wage workers, their wages were not only pressed towards subsistence levels, but oftentimes were reduced further by various devices such as manipulating the time or not paying for production below a set quota. Those devices sometimes left the worker with no wages at all. It seems justified in this instance, therefore, to claim a more literal comparison rather than a rhetorical one. And not so much for its shock value, although that too would not be a bad thing, but rather to try to refine the questions we might ask of ourselves, to gain a more reflexive insight into some of the contradictions of our current moment, by the discursive act of distancing ourselves from that moment. One way to do this, perhaps, is to ask why such anomalies as slave-like labor should occur in our otherwise progressive democratic era, when, at least a few years ago, our current president said freedom was on the march. But to propose the heretical notion that these developments are of a piece with that seemingly ancient labor flow we know as the international slave trade, and that our current moral and political dilemmas about its resolution are continuous with those that our predecessors confronted when trying to imagine the world that would follow upon the abolition of slave labor systems. Like Jefferson's famous fire bell in the night, these revelations awaken us to the fault lines of our vaunted self-image as image of progress and modernity, to the archaic forms of human relations that are dogging our steps into the 21st century. They surely underscore the necessity for reflection and mobilization to correct the sins of our present, of our here and now. On this particular occasion, however, they may also have another function or utility. For a gathering of students, many students here, of 19th century emancipation, they might suggest an opportunity, perhaps even an obligation, to refine, if not recast, our inquiries of that earlier moment. So tonight, I will be attempting to parse the complex meanings that I think these vignettes illuminate about the historical and biblical chord that links our present moment with that of those slaves, rebel slaves at Trois-Rivières, Guadeloupe, 2 centuries ago. The multiplicality of the language of God parentage of French friends of the sans-papiers just a decade ago, which I will argue echoes down the centuries an essential aspect of citizenship in the modern nation state. And most of all, something of the complex meanings, the antinomies of freedom and citizenship in the modern world, which first emerged in the 19th century emancipation campaigns and that continues in many ways into our present. My particular preoccupations here have grown out of my earlier work on slavery emancipation, work in which I have struggled to comprehend freedom as a conceptual and historical problem. It soon came to me that these were not just discrete problems soluble by ever more intensive research, but part of a larger problematique, though as yet a still undefined one. That is to say, as distinct from a problem, which is a question looking for an answer. A problematique, as I use the term here, is a terrain of inquiry for which the appropriate researchable questions still need to be formulated. Strictly or formally, speaking, the problematique provides the conceptual framework for the formulation of problems. Of course, sometimes we are alerted to the need for a new conceptual schema in the first place because the empirical anomalies that present themselves that demand answers. But either way, many of the most pervasive and enduring problems of the human experience, and the problem of race and gender come readily to mind, cannot and will not be solved simply by the accumulation of new facts. More often than not, their solution requires of us a radical and rigorous re-examination of those conceptual frames within which our empirical questions are posed. Reckoning with the problem of freedom and citizenship in the modern world is one such issue. Certainly when I began my own academic career, the problematic guiding studies of Reconstruction period in the U.S. were very different. At that time, the study of the post-emancipation period had little of the incredible energy that then animated slavery. I'm sort of dating myself here, of course. Enlivened by the various contemporary political controversies for which slavery was presumed to hold answers, historians dive into such tempests as the then swirling around Daniel Patrick Moynihan's infamous claims about the weakness of the black family traditions, and which were presumed to have dated from slavery. Or they took on the dubious arguments of others that slavery had destroyed any cultural basis for African American political solidarity and resistance, and thereby compromised contemporary freedom struggles. By contrast, the freedom that followed slavery seemed relatively static as a field of inquiry. Contrasting sharply with slavery studies, which had been profoundly reshaped in the 1960s and 70s by comparative or cross-national perspective, studies of the post-emancipation era remain relatively provincial, hewing closely to the American national narrative. For students of slavery, it was merely the endpoint of an heroic struggle, while its temporal frame for many students of Reconstruction was as distant as the distant prelude of the mid-20th century civil rights movement. Its significance lay mainly in the legal precedents it established and the national promise it proffered that would finally be redeemed belatedly in our own time, 100 years later. What Martin Luther King once referred to as the unredeemed blank check of American democracy. In a strange reversal of what one might have expected, therefore, the story of slavery took on the uplifting form of romance, while that of its aftermath was sketched in the more somber hues of tragedy and betrayal. Langston Hughes' memorable phrase, a festering dream deferred. But why, I ask, should one feel compelled to return to the days of slavery to address contemporary issues of American life, African American life and culture, family and politics, ideology and belief? Surely what happened after slavery also mattered to the formation of our present. Somehow, in my view, to think otherwise seemed to freeze black folk in time, ever emergent from that prior formative moment. Indeed, many of my contemporaries went even further, skipping over slavery as well, to find roots of African American in an African past beyond memory. What was needed, it seemed to me, though I hardly had the language to articulate it at the time, was to re-examine freedom itself, not just as an era in time, but as a conceptual whole, as a system of social relations in its own right, as a moment of formation relevant to the 20th century. Indeed, perhaps one even more relevant than slavery to our present predicament. Much of the work I have undertaken over the intervening years has aimed more or less at that larger goal. Tonight, I'd like to sketch in bold strokes how further work in this vein might be imagined, how one might frame a study of emancipation that speaks to the issues of freedom and citizenship in the 21st century. Freedom is a word rife with ambiguity and contradiction, even in the more learned and careful discourses of scholars. Fortunately, we are now blessed with a considerable body of historical work, notably David Bryan Davis, Eric Foner, who's with us tonight, Ira Berlin, and many others, with which to frame that it's problematic, to elaborate the conceptual architecture of the problem of freedom in the modern world. What all of this work underscores, I think, is that the concept of freedom has a history, and thus it is not some innate, transcendent quality of the human spirit floating above particular histories. It is important then that we recognize how slave emancipation in the 19th century marked a radical break in that history, a breach in the conceptual framework that reframed freedom's very condition of possibility. The rebel slaves at Trois-Rivières sensed as much, I think. When hailed by French troops, who goes there, they answered, citizens. No longer slaves, not simply free men, but citizens. Thus they mark a caesure, a rupture in the long history of slavery. Forever after, slave rebellions would move or would seek to move along that same trajectory. By 1947, as the title of Tenenbaum's seminal book suggests, this trajectory would announce itself as normal, expected, the only way to inhabit a true and meaningful freedom. This had not always been so. Before the modern era, release from slavery was hardly tantamount to passage into freedom, as we now understand it. One certainly did not become a citizen, or even a whole free agent in the arrangement of one's economic and social affairs. One simply moved into a niche within a social hierarchy, taking one's place along a kind of continuum of social status framed and anchored by lordship and bondage. Indeed, Orlando Patterson's broad survey of slave systems has enhanced our appreciation for how thoroughly the manumission of slaves in the pre-modern world was simply the other side of the coin of bondage. In fact, successful slave governance everywhere depended on the slave safety valve of manumission, in much the same way that the management of prisoners today depends on the possibility of eventual parole. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States and a major Virginia slaveholder, was quite explicit in this when he discussed the political calculus of slaveholding. Slavery could not survive without manumission, he wrote one of his relatives in December 1785, and the fools, as he called them, in the Virginia legislature, bent on restricting the master's right to free his slaves, were merely hastening the day of total emancipation. They believed that reducing the numbers of free blacks by making manumission more difficult would make them safe, he fumed. But their actions would reap exactly the opposite of the security they sought. Madison's insight is confirmed by the management of diverse slave systems throughout the hemisphere. Though often phrased as a master's bounty for faithful service, manumission was more often than not a reciprocal exchange transaction, anticipating something in return, usually his or her future service and fealty. Thus, even the foolish slaveholders of whom James Madison complained, who did not appreciate the utility of manumission as a safety valve in the workings of bondage, even they were probably well aware of its usefulness in enhancing labor exploitation. For example, there's ample evidence that ostensibly free manumissions in Brazil, for example, which had the largest free black population in the hemisphere, were more often than not conditioned on the recipient continuing his or her labor service to the owner's estate and or to his heirs. Indeed, such conditional manumissions became a favorite legal ruse, enabling slaveholders to pass on an inheritance, for example, that could not be legally seized for debt under Brazilian law. Far from being a radical break with slavery, therefore, this freedom was more a continued subordination and exploitation under different rules. All in all, one historian has concluded, black ex-slaves in Brazil did not become citizens. They simply became ex-slaves. It is now widely acknowledged that during the Age of Revolution, Western ideas about slavery and freedom were radically transformed. We also know, as Benedict Anderson has famously argued, that this era would witness a conceptual revolution in statecraft, one in which the very nature of Western nation-state, the very premise on which a nation was constituted, what constituted the nation, was fundamentally altered. These parallel developments, I will argue, intersected to reframe the meaning and import of freeing a slave, the act of freeing a slave. Positing that the modern nation is not a historical given, but the product of social historical processes, Anderson muses about the problem of reducing the new nation state, rendering the new nation state emotionally plausible, his words, as well as politically viable, once the comforting hierarchies of aristocratic lineage had been stripped away. Given the sheer emotional novelty of the modern nation state, therefore, the capacity to think and feel nationness only became possible through the radical change of consciousness, a changed sense of space and time, and thus of social relations. Separation from king and country required a new consciousness of we-ness, one premised quite literally on novel criteria, not ancient lineage, and not obeisance and fealty to an aristocratic polity. People must now picture themselves as part of a physical and conceptual abstraction, their loyalties, allegiances, and social ties mediated not in face-to-face interactions or embedded in a political religious hierarchical order. The nation must be imagined as a horizontal plane rather than a vertical ladder. Thus, the relationship among those admitted within its bounded space was fundamentally transformed, with significant implications for decisions about who was in and who was outside. This change not only had profound implications for the emancipation of slaves, it raised the stakes. While acknowledged by contemporaries or not, it posed Tannenbaum's question: could the former slave also be a citizen? Were the qualities of character that made one suitable for subordinated cheap labor an insuperable barrier to acceptance as an equal member of the polity? Of course, these questions were somewhat muted in many Atlantic world polities because most of their white population did not occupy equal standing in the political process. But over time, they rose to the surface of political discourse everywhere. When the rebels on Guadeloupe demanded to be recognized as citizens, therefore, they thrust themselves into a modern political habitus, into the world we still inhabit, and they linked their story and struggles to our own. Their action reframed both how we might understand the stakes of their and other slaves' bid for freedom, and how we might articulate the tensions between labor reprieve and citizenship in our own historical moment, when the modern nation-state's need for the free movement of labor can actually be antithetical to the workers' claims to citizenship. To explore this theme, let us return to my second vignette, the case of the slaves, quote unquote, uncovered in those Los Angeles sweatshops. But now taking that case not simply as rhetorical ammunition against contemporary capitalism, but as part of a larger and more fundamental dynamic. The geopolitical conjunctures in this scenario should be all too familiar to students of the evolution and destruction of Atlantic slave labor systems. As was the case with slave labor and with the indentured labor of East Indian and Chinese immigrants that developed in many American societies after slavery was abolished. Speaking here of Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Brazil, Cuba, and others. The fundamental rationale was the reallocation of productive resources, the movement of workers' bodies from areas of presumed low labor demand to those of high demand. This development should not be naturalized, as some economists are wont to do, with abstract, morally cleansed notions like supply and demand. There was not a natural-born population surplus in 18th century West Africa, for example, but rather a deliberate social dislocation in response to pressures and opportunities that came with the roughly simultaneous European penetration of Africa and the Americas, and the impact this had on the respective indigenous economies and politics, or polities, of those areas. Thus, slavery in the Americas developed not as a natural outcome of an unbalanced land-labor ratio demanding workers. Rather, it arose from the perceived necessity to mobilize and manage a labor force to produce goods for which Europeans had discovered a demand. We cannot stress too strongly, I would argue, that the creation of the global relations of labor and consumption is to some extent constitutive of the advent of modernity. Indeed, the Atlantic slave trade was at its initial nexus, as it both stimulated and depended upon the coordination of the global movement of labor and new consumer goods. A similarly complex nexus of production and consumption drives the current situation, which strongly suggests that that earlier Atlantic system prefigured the development of 21st century global economy. In some ways, then, the changes set in motion in the late 20th century that we have labeled globalization is but the latest phase of that development. These cases underscore the fact that labor under slave-like conditions is neither a turn of phrase nor an exaggeration, because such systems depend on the command of labor in all possible meanings of that term. Cheap labor, as it is often designated, gets to be cheap through the application of a concrete repertoire of controls. Sometimes actual physical violence cheapens labor, and there are examples of this in reports from contemporary sweatshops. But more generally, labor is rendered cheap and docile by restrictions on its ability to organize and bargain collectively at the worksite, or its access to potential allies outside the workplace. And in a further step, as with African slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries and Asian indentured laborers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these 21st century slave-like workers are racialized by falling into the category of the stranger, the outsider, the not us. Their very identity as human, with human rights, becomes a question of debate and contestation rather than a given. Sometimes literally sequestered, hidden, and unreachable denizens in the recessed enclaves of our domestic spaces, sometimes rendered as shadowy figures or in a distant, benighted land. They take on the stereotyped character of their ascribed spaces. Like the slaves of another era, whether objects of pity or of demonization, they are not possible agents of their own lives, and thus their possibilities to be like or among us as equals becomes difficult to imagine. Thus, one of the pressing problems of the 21st century is to find a way to reimagine our national spaces so as to incorporate these now liminal figures, especially since, like the slaves of another era, it is us who have made them. How do we make them? In the late 1960s, major industries in G7 countries, then G7 countries, seeking to establish operations in cheap areas of quote-unquote cheap labor with less state regulation, moved production to offshore sites in developing countries, especially in the Caribbean Basin and Southeast Asia. By the 1970s, new financial service providers emerged, bringing new technologies and technical expertise that fostered innovations in the mobilization and management of capital. Associated with these developments also was the social spatial phenomenon that Saskia Sassen has called global cities, like New York, Tokyo, London, the service centers of the global economy. Bringing the sweatshop workers within the framework of Sassen's analysis of the rise of global cities suggests that this development was not some sideshow of modern political economy, but linked to its main currents. They figured into the warp and woof of the fabric of modern life. Workers, some undocumented, some legal, some fearfully exploited, some not, but all functioning in an informal economy not regulated by law. Many are in sweatshops like those I've just described, making luxury and casual apparel to clothe our bodies. Others clean our houses and care for our children. They are found in the thoroughfares of our streets in our major urban areas, driving gypsy cabs or vending all sorts of merchandise. Their statuses and situation vary widely, but what they have in common is that they constitute a parallel class of service workers to a highly paid professional service sector manning the technology of the globalized economy. Arguably, they make the latter's very existence possible. The scenario I've just described deviates from the iconographic image of the American immigrant that fills our school books and the political stump speeches we still hear. Poor but proud, living in nuclear households, struggling to climb the ladder of success. They might pass through wage labor for a while, as Lincoln so famously described, but then they will acquire a little shop, and finally a lucky few would become secure bourgeois entrepreneurs and Republicans. There's enough truth to this portrait to make it almost unassailable, and certainly unpatriotic to question it. But for every Korean storekeeper one might find in the shadows of our global cities a different kind of entrepreneur, more like the Chinese small factory operators in Sunset Park in Brooklyn could be found, built on exploited labor of other Chinese, illegal entrants struggling to find a secure place in the world as free citizens of their adopted nation. The human flow that brought them here, however, was set in motion by more distant dislocations in the economies of the countries from which they came. A great deal of that dislocation prompted by early American and other investments in offshore production facilities. In many cases, recruitment into urban and rural labor pools in their homelands preceded their migration to low-wage jobs in global cities like Los Angeles and New York. Now, another striking feature of our contemporary labor crisis is that the worker in question is more likely than not to be a woman, whether found in a factory, a home, or a bordello. Although well known, this is a startling fact about contemporary international labor flows that demands greater scrutiny, especially as it might inform the nexus between labor and citizenship I have sketched here. Although the gender ratio of this 20th century international labor recruitment is exactly opposite that of the 18th and 19th centuries, I am convinced that bringing studies of the two moments into conversation could be mutually enlightening. Let us consider to begin with the fundamental reversals and the character of such labor over the period we're discussing, and its implications for the prospects of the laborer becoming a citizen and friend. As we now know, although men predominated among Africans transported in the original Atlantic slave trade by a ratio of up to 2-to-1 at times, both men and women were crucial to slave labor regimes, whether in southwest Georgia, cotton plantations, or on the western Jamaican sugar estates. It was no accident, then, that a principal battleground after slavery was the recruitment and control of women's and children's labor. The outcomes of that struggle varied. Sharecropping in the American South that recaptured much of that labor eventually, and what Sid Mintz called the peasant breach in places like Jamaica that gave women and their families resources for continued resistance and a measure of control. In both places, however, women became a formidable force in the political sphere. They became de facto political actors, even if not formally recognized as such. Our contemporary scene looks very different. As I've noted, women seem to be overrepresented in the new cheap labor force, which suggests that many of their menfolk, husbands, sons, and fathers, may well have been thrust out of the labor force altogether into positions of dependency, living on their remittances from first world work sites or the outsourced factories near their homes. Meanwhile, not only are their women folks' roles as workers rendered relatively invisible, so are their possible roles as political actors and citizens. Now, I must confess here that I am not at present prepared to go much beyond these rudimentary and trenchant observations, nor do I have time. I thought it worth advancing them nonetheless, because I believe that a deeper analysis of this phenomenon is sorely needed, and that it might just be mutually beneficial to students of the 19th century emancipation on one hand, and those exploring 21st century labor migrations on the other. Recent studies of U.S. Reconstruction, in particular, have made us keenly sensitive to the interplay of gender, labor, and citizenship. Our own times could benefit from similar perspectives and insights. It may well be that the fact that the stranger knocking at our gate is often a young woman, often with continued ties to a distant home place, and that this complicates our capacity to address her exploitation and our own culpability. Contemporary developments lend an entirely new perspective, I think, to the title Tannenbaum chose for his book, Slave and Citizen. Indeed, the notion that slaves actually became equal citizens anywhere certainly contributed to the skepticism with which Tannenbaum's thesis was treated. Much of the scholarship since leaves little doubt that he overstated the case, to say the least. Nonetheless, his formulation, in my opinion, correctly frames a larger problematic of freedom in the modern world. Freedom, self-determination, security do not exist outside citizenship, and thus civic belonging was crucial to the realization of freedom after slavery. Ex-slaves everywhere recognize as much, even if many subsequent historians have not. Once again, our contemporary difficulties addressing issues of basic human justice, imagining and delineating human rights in a world of nation states, reimagining national formation, with all its attendant questions about boundaries, national integrity, and belonging. All this draws a bright red arrow back to those late 18th and mid-19th century moments of Jubilee. There may be some utility in revisiting them in light of our present dilemmas. Although sweatshop workers are but a tiny minority of American workers, the recent numbers in the U.S., I guess, are estimated at 200,000 or so, give or take, though millions more work abroad under companies with some subcontracts to American firms. Their plight, nonetheless, is more than emblematic of a larger class of the world's labor force, in Europe as well as America, who are effectively non-citizens in their places of labor. Like the French sans-papiers, they are strangers at the gate whose knock poses a profound problem to democratic governance. In many cases, like the sans-papiers, they are less strangers than members of the extended national family, returnees coming to a home country they help to build, even if they have never seen it. In some cases, as with the quasi-colonial connections of the United States to its southern neighbors, the links are perhaps more or less politically complicated. But they still reflect the delayed social fallout from earlier projections of the vectors of American capital and power outside its national borders. In either case, the connections are not simply historical, but part of the nature of modern capitalist economies, which are ever dependent on global capital flows and labor recruitment, here or there, which makes this phenomenon of the ostensible stranger at the gate one that is practically relevant because it is not likely to go away, and a moral imperative because it challenges fundamental notions about the meaningfulness of freedom in the contemporary world. From the historical advent of the modern nation state during the Age of Revolution, the nation's very existence has turned on the question of who belongs. The very idea that national citizenship as such constitutes one's moral personality, one's moral claims to an equal humanity, has a divided history. According to one strand of thought, with the collapse of divine monarchies and the emergence of the modern state systems, national belonging became a necessity to the constitution of one's rights as a rights-bearing person. As the Hague Convention of 1930 declared, every person should have a nationality. The point was driven home even more emphatically by Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren 30 years later. Citizenship, he wrote, is a man's basic right, for it is nothing less than the right to have rights. A stateless person, he went on, would be deprived of any lawful claims to protection from any nation. This idea of neatly bounded states, made up of persons bearing neatly bounded bundles of rights, still dominates our national imaginary. And yet, work on citizenship and voting in the United States, by a broad range of legal scholars, political scientists, historians, has shown the convoluted twists and turns and how the question of citizenship has been addressed and answered historically. And most importantly, it suggests that no answer is ever final. While on the face of it, citizenship would seem to presuppose an inside and an outside, members and non-members, the fact is that many nation states have found it advantageous from time to time to allow dual citizenship. For example, it would have been totally disruptive of the new state of Lithuania established in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, to have not recognized the dual citizenship claims of Russians in its midst. There are numerous other examples like that, where this national belonging is in fact fractured, parceled, sometimes even ambiguous. While all nation-states recognize the necessity of adjudicating citizenship claims to assure allegiance and national solidarity, therefore, they have actually deployed a bewildering array of strategies to achieve those goals. So where does this leave the worker rendered stateless today because of her undocumented entry into the nation? Well, there's another trend of thought, now well documented in the U.S. case, of non-citizen workers exercising at least some citizenship rights historically, including the right to vote. As the late constitutional scholar Alexander Bickel pointed out some years ago, the United States Constitution was actually written in terms of the rights of inhabitants and persons rather than citizens, a term that slipped into state and federal laws a bit later. Non-citizens of all kinds exercised the right to vote in a number of states. Indeed, it was not until 1928 that all Indians were barred from voting in all states. And as Alex Kesar has shown, the rationale for extending suffrage rights had less to do with the high moral principles or political theory than with the raw political necessities and opportunities, often generated by social crises and war. By definition, the success of suffrage expansion required some group who had already had suffrage rights finding some advantage in extending it to another that didn't possess it. Moreover, until the anti-immigrant panics of recent years, there have been numerous rights and benefits that non-citizens enjoyed along with citizens, including education, welfare, and so forth. Indeed, this is part of the reason that so many inhabitants were perhaps slow to actually naturalize as citizens. I will not attempt to go further here to suggest what political process might resolve our present difficulties in negotiating these issues, or even what form of proactivist agenda that might take. More consistent with the spirit of this lecture, I would rather end with some thoughts on how we might begin to arrive at a different imaginary of belonging and inclusion that might form part of the conceptual grounding for that different politics. It will not be surprising to you, no doubt, that my imaginary forms in part around my reflections on the subjects I have been discussing tonight. Scenes of former slaves seeking entry into within the public body of citizens, some of them, like the various American slave rebels during the Age of Revolution, even at the moment of the inception of those new national bodies. They too, we must remember, were perceived as cultural strangers and outsiders, despite being integral to the very making of the social economies of those of whose polities they now wish to enter. Though seemingly over there and other, they were in reality very much a part of the here and the us. True, they were different because their social formation and lived experiences were different. But perceiving that difference as a threat was a choice that need not be made. And here I would like to share with you some reflections on a very different sort that I found stimulating in thinking about this problem. In a book entitled Democracy and the Foreigner, Bonnie Honeck suggests that contrary to the conventional thinking, the foreigner has played a crucial role in the historical and literary imaginary of how to consolidate and reconstitute democratic societies. That is, communities constituted paradoxically by the a priori givenness of membership at the same time as the chosenness of that membership. That is, one is always already a member by birth, even as one repeatedly enacts the choice of membership in a democratic polity, since its origins and sustenance lie in the freely bestowed consent of its members. And since such a community is defined solely by the fellowship of the beings within it, membership is ever subject to negotiation and renegotiation. Given this circumstance, the intrusion of the foreigner or the outsider within, Honeck argues, can be constitutive, and not just in the most obvious sense of affirming a foil against which its members' distinctive character can be identified. Instead, Honeck takes us through an amazing and diverse array of texts in which the foreigner is actually the founder of the community or its source of revitalization, because that role can only be enacted by a non-member an outsider. Thus, from figures like Moses to Ruth in biblical Israel, from Rousseau's lawgiver in The Social Contract to Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, Honeck shows how outsiders' figures have founded, revitalized, or enabled community formation. Honeck's point is not simply literary. She wants to suggest this phenomena as an ongoing, replicable principle of the growth and revitalization of democratic societies. That is to say, that it is not merely tolerance of the newcomer who brings difference in her way, but the necessity of foreignness, of difference, to the continued health of the body politic. Democracy itself is a politics among strangers, she argues. Furthermore, democracy in our present moment requires not the myth of national kinship, but a cosmopolitan consciousness that assumes responsibility for the strangers both here and in other lands. If this position has merit, and obviously I offer it thinking that it does, then we need to think anew, to re-envision our modern nations, so inherently dependent on the infusion of new people as labor, will be embraced, how our modern nations will be able to embrace them also as members of the polity, as citizens. Like those slave rebels who greeted the soldiers of revolutionary France in Guadeloupe some 2 centuries ago, calling out, "We are citizens and friends." We might yet respond with the French revolutionary soldiers, "Welcome to our